Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Robert from El Magnifico Games, and today we are going to continue our usual Wednesday activities of reading some poetry, of reading through Pride and Prejudice, and finishing up with some riddles. But first I should probably apologise for starting slightly late. With that out the way, we should probably recap where we were with the poetry. We had moved on to Robert Browning. I think we had got on to Robert Browning 2 weeks ago, but we were reading through several of his poems last week, and we shall start there. Now, how far had we got? I think The Lost Mistress was the last one that we'd read. So I shall begin by rereading that to remind us, and then we shall move on if there's not much more to say. So, The Lost Mistress by Robert Browning. All's over then, does truth sound bitter, as one at first believes? Hark, 'tis the sparrow's good-night twitter, about your cottage eaves. And the leaf buds on the vine are woolly, I noticed that today. One day more bursts them open fully, you know the red turns grey. Tomorrow we meet the same then, dearest, may I take your hand in mine? We're friends are we, well friends the merest, keep much that I resign. For each glance of the eye so bright and black, though I keep with heart's endeavour your voice when you wish the snowdrops back, though it stay in my soul forever. Yet I will but say what mere friends say, or only a thought stronger. I will hold your hand but as long as all may, or so very little longer. I believe we came to the conclusion that that was about a couple who were wanted to only publicly be seen as friends, that they had to be very discreet, presumably owing to the times in which, as in the era in which their relationship was taking place. I also seem to remember there was a fair few metaphors in this which I wasn't fully following. I remember us looking up what the significance of snowdrops could be, and I believe we came to the conclusion that snowdrops were related to modesty and even chasteness. But it wasn't clear what they meant by your voice when you wish the snowdrops back, though it stay in my soul forever. So, before we move on, is there anything more to say about that? I suppose not. So, we'll move on to Home Thoughts from the Sea. Nobly, Cape St. My apologies. Nobly, Cape St. Vincent to the northwest died away. Sunset ran, one glorious blood red, reeking into the Cadiz Bay. Bluish mid the burning water, full in face Trafalgar lay, and the dimmer northeast distance dawned Gibraltar grand and grey. Here and here did England help me, how can I help England say? Whoso turns his eye this evening, turn to God to praise and pray, while Jove's planet rises yonder silent over Africa. I don't fully follow this. I think we're going to have to look up some of these places and see the significance, but I am detecting what I think may be a degree of patriotism, but we shall see. So, let's start by looking up Cape St. Vincent. Jenny says a sense of colonialism, isn't it? That's what I'm thinking it may be. But let's not prejudge this. Cape St. Vincent. Cape St. Vincent is a headland in the municipality of Vila do Bispo in the Algarve, southern Portugal. It is the southwesternmost point of Portugal and of mainland Europe. So, is there any history which would link it significantly to England or Britain? Not that I can see. According to legend, the name of this cape is linked to the story of martyrdom, to the story of martyred 4th century Iberian deacon St. Vincent, whose body was brought ashore here. A shrine was erected over his grave. According to the Arab geographer Al-Idrisi, it was always guarded by ravens and is therefore named by him Kanisa al-Ghurab, meaning Church of the Raven. King Alfonso Henriques had the body of the saint exhumed in 1173 and brought it by ship to Lisbon, still accompanied by the ravens. This transfer of the relics is depicted on the coat of arms of Lisbon. All existing buildings, including the Villa do Infante of Henry the Navigator, fell into ruins because of the Lisbon earthquake of 1755. The Franciscan friars who cared for the shrine stayed on until 1834, when all monasteries were disbanded in Portugal. Okay, so I'm not aware of any link to England or Britain, but when it says nobly, nobly, Cape St. Vincent to the northwest died away, that would be consistent with this being a significant religious site which, well, by that point had already died away. Now, probably worth having a quick look at St. Vincent, see what he's known for. When the Roman Emperor Diocletian began persecuting Christians in Spain, both were brought before the Roman governor Dacian in Valencia. Vincent and his bishop Valerius were confined to the prison of Valencia. Though he was finally offered release if he would consign scripture to the fire, Vincent refused. Speaking on behalf of his bishop, he informed the judge that they were ready to suffer everything for their faith and that they could pay no heed either to threats or promises. His outspoken manner so angered the governor that he had every sort of torture inflicted on Vincent. He was stretched on the rack and his flesh torn with iron hooks. Then his wounds were rubbed with salt and he was burned alive under a red-hot gridiron. Finally he was cast into prison and laid on a floor scattered with broken pottery, where he died. During his martyrdom he preserved such peace and tranquility that it astonished his jailer, who repented from his sins and was converted. Vincent's dead body was thrown into the sea in a sack, but was later recovered by the Christians, and his veneration immediately spread throughout the church. The aged bishop Valerius was exiled. Because this was above a bit that I skipped. Because Valeria suffered from a speech impediment, Vincent acted as his spokesman. So that's the connection between the two. The story that Vincent was tortured on a gridiron is perhaps adapted from the martyrdom of another son of Huesca, Lawrence. Vincent, like many early martyrs in the early hagiographic literature, succeeded in converting his jailer. According to legend, after being martyred, ravens protected Vincent's body from being devoured by vultures until his followers could recover the body. His body was taken to what is now known as Cape St. Vincent. A shrine was erected over his grave, which continued to be guarded by flocks of ravens. In the time of Muslim rule in the Iberian Peninsula, the hagiographer Al-Idrisi, I don't speak Arabic, so I'm probably butchering that. Note this constant guard by ravens, which a place was named by him, Kanisa al-Ghurab, Church of the Raven, King Alfonso. Okay, we've read all that already. Now, all saints are supposed to have performed some form of miracle. So it's not clear what miracle he committed, unless he was responsible for. I suppose the two candidates are maintaining his composure under torture, which is remarkable, but I'm not sure you'd call it miraculous. Or perhaps the ravens protecting his body. It's not clear which. Still, that's getting a bit off topic for just finding out what Cape St. Vincent is. He's the patron of São Vicente, Lisbon, Algarve, Valencia, Vicenza, Italy, vinegar makers, winemakers, Order of Deacons of the Catholic Diocese of Bergamo. Again, I'm probably butchering all those names. Okay, so we have an idea who he was. So I would suggest that the reference to nobly Cape St. Vincent to the northwest died away is literally talking about the fact that Cape St. Vincent suffered an earthquake and the area later became at the very least the religious presence there disappeared. I'm not sure it said that I think people were still there, but it says that the Franciscan friars who cared for the shrine stayed on until 1834, when all monasteries were disbanded in Portugal. I'm sure there's some very interesting history behind that, but again, staying on topic. So, sunset ran one glorious blood red, reeking into Cadiz Bay. So, Cadiz Bay. Bay of Cadiz is a body of water in the province of Cadiz, Spain, adjacent to the southwestern coast of the Iberian Peninsula. The Bay of Cadiz adjoins the Gulf of Cadiz, a larger body of water which is the same area but further ashore, which is in the same area. The shores of the Bay of Cadiz include the municipalities of Cadiz, San Fernando, Puerto Real, El Puerto de Santa Maria, and Rota. Again, my pronunciation, absolutely awful. The bay forms a natural harbour which, according to available archaeological evidence, has been inhabited since very ancient times. The Bahia de Cadiz Natural Park is located on the shores of the Bay of Cadiz. So, not much help there, other than that it's a place which is connected to the Iberian Peninsula, perhaps indicating a journey. Bluish mid the burning water, full in face Trafalgar lay. Obviously that's where the Battle of Trafalgar was fought. Interesting, between the British Royal Navy and the combined fleets of the French and Spanish navies. That makes sense. I didn't realise the Spanish were fighting with the French, but that does make sense, historically speaking. As part of Napoleon's plans to invade England, the French and Spanish fleets combined to take control of the English Channel and provide the Grande Armée safe passage. But it's the place we're interested in, although it may be connected to British history. Cape Trafalgar is a headland of the province of Cadiz in the southwest of Spain. The naval battle of Trafalgar, in which the Royal Navy, commanded by Admiral Horatio Nelson, decisively defeated Napoleon's combined Spanish and French fleet, took place just off the Cape. Cape Trafalgar lies in the shore of the Atlantic Ocean, northwest of the Strait of Gibraltar. The International Hydrographic Organization defines the western limit of the strait in the Mediterranean Sea as a line that joins Cape Trafalgar to the north with Cape Spartel to the south. The most prominent structure on the Cape is a 34-metre high lighthouse, the Faro de Cabo Trafalgar, which was first illuminated on the 15th of July 1862. The name is of Arabic origin, deriving either from Trafalgar, Cape of the Cave, Laurel, or from Jaffa al-Garb, Cape of the West. In both cases, Taraf means edge or extremity and refers to a promontory. In modern Arabic, however, this place is sometimes described as Al-Taraf al-Agar. In May 2021, 2,000-year-old Roman baths emerged from the sand dunes of Cape Trafalgar, including entire walls, windows and doors. That is very interesting, but they wouldn't have known that when this poem was written. So bluish mid the burning water, full in face Trafalgar lay. So this seems to be all in the same, roughly the same part of the world, and we seem to be travelling eastwards, I believe. I'd have to look at a map to be sure, but it seems that way. In the dimmest northeast distance dawned Gibraltar grand and grey. Okay. Gibraltar. Gibraltar. Is a British overseas territory located at the southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula. Okay, so it sounds like we're heading south then. It is bordered to the north by Spain. The landscape is dominated by the Rock of Gibraltar, at the foot of which is a densely populated town area. In 1704, Anglo-Dutch forces captured Gibraltar from Spain during the War of the Spanish Succession. The territory was ceded to Great Britain in perpetuity under the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. It became an important base for the Royal Navy, particularly during the Napoleonic Wars and World War II, as it controlled the narrow entrance and exit to the Mediterranean Sea, the Strait of Gibraltar, which is only 14.3 kilometres wide. This choke point remains strategically important, with half of the world's seaborne trade passing through it. Gibraltar's economy is based largely on tourism, online gambling, financial services, and bunkering. The sovereignty of Gibraltar is a point of contention in Anglo-Spanish relations, as Spain asserts a claim to the territory. Gibraltar overwhelmingly rejected proposals for Spanish sovereignty in a 1967 referendum and for shared sovereignty in a 2002 referendum. Nevertheless, Gibraltar maintains close economic and cultural links with Spain, and with many Gibraltarians speaking Spanish, as well as a local dialect known as Lanito. Again, I'm probably butchering that pronunciation. On the 31st of January 2020, the UK and Gibraltar left the European Union. In December 2020, the UK and Spain agreed in principle to a basis in which the UK and EU might negotiate terms for Gibraltar to participate in aspects of the Schengen Agreement. Okay, all very interesting. Most of that predates this. Most of that postdates this poem. So, again, we're in the same part of the world. This all could be part of one voyage. the last two places mentioned obviously could be related to the Napoleonic War. Here and here did England help me, how can I help England say? So that seems to be saying England has helped us in this part of the world, how can this part of the world help England? I assume. Although I must admit, I'm not entirely sure the extent to which those regions were necessarily helped by England so much as they were strategically very important to England, well, Britain really, in its interests at the time. But benefit the doubt, I suppose. I'm not overly familiar with that history. Whoso turns his eye this evening, turn to God to praise and pray, while Jove's planet rises yonder silent over Africa. See, it's hard for me to look at that and not think that this is making reference to things that Britain has done which are supposedly so grand, and then the reference to Africa in a almost prophetic way towards, well, to suggest, well, Africa's next. But I could be wrong. This, of course, would have predated most... This would have predated the... I believe this would have predated the opening up of Africa. There were colonies in Africa at this point, but I believe they were all in the southernmost tip of Africa. Some held by the Dutch, I believe. A small amount of it to England. Some German, possibly. I'd have to look it up to be 100% certain. But this was before the mass colonization of Africa, I believe. Anywho, this poem does just give me the, even though I don't feel like I fully grasp it, it just gives me the sense of England's done great things. England's doing God's work. Hey, look at Africa. Still, any thoughts, chat? I believe so. The British invested in the development of roads and railways. They brought new ideas about education and medicine, although they also brought diseases with them. Well, this is very true. But again, this would have predated most of that. I believe the Britons were doing God's work to Africa. Well. I have no doubt that the Britons that went over there genuinely, or the majority of, as far as the colonial office is concerned and Britain's official presence in Africa, I have no doubt that the people that came over genuinely had the best interests of Africa and its people in their mind. The native Africans may well not have seen it that way, though, shall we say, and a lot of what went on there has set up problems that continue to this day. Some of which there has been very valid criticism about, and some of which there's been, in some people's opinion, not so valid criticism about, but be that as it may, it's It's a very divisive area. Kind of a bit. Kind of a bit. What's the word? If I'm right that this predates the mass colonization of Africa, it's almost a bit slightly shocking to just see the casual reference like that, assuming that is what the poem is about. Let's see. Robert Browning was 1812 to 1889. Okay, so actually this could... I don't know when he wrote this one specifically. This one could be after the wider colonization of Africa. Because essentially, as I understand it, various European groups started to colonize Africa several hundred years before they actually got anywhere. For a very long time, the colonies that existed were small and on the very southern coast. The scramble of Africa, I think, is what I'm talking about. Established empires, notably Britain, France, Spain and Portugal, had already claimed coastal areas but had not penetrated deeply inland. That's what I had described. Or was describing, rather. Notable they don't mention Germany here, because I'm fairly certain Germany did hold a small amount of Africa. In fact, I know they did. Anyway, what was I looking for? Some sort of date. Yeah, it looks like it didn't, the so-called scramble for Africa didn't even really begin until the 1870s. Yeah. So that's consistent with my memory of this area, of this part of history. So it seems quite likely that Home Thoughts from the Sea was probably written before this, but I can't be certain. Anyway, that was a interesting dive into some geography and history. So I'll read the poem again, and then we'll see if we have anything more to say about it, and if not, we'll move on. Nobly, nobly, Cape St. Vincent to the northwest died away. Sunset rain, one glorious blood red, reeking into Cadiz Bay. Sorry, I'm going to start again because I think I did a particularly bad job of that. Nobly, nobly, Cape St. Vincent to the northwest died away. Sunset ran, one glorious blood red, reeking into Cadiz Bay. Bluish mid the burning water, full in face Trafalgar lay. In the dimmest northeast distance dawned Gibraltar grand and grey. Here and here did England help me, how can I help England say? Whoso turns as I this evening, turn to God to praise and pray. While Jove's planet rises yonder, silent over Africa. Assuming this was written before, it is just so chilling when you know the history that followed. Like, I fully comprehend that those writing this really must have had the best of intentions. And I genuinely believe in some ways they did, or they did achieve some of the things they set out to do, but, you know, if you know the, as I say, if you know the history, it's a bit chilling. Silent over Africa sounds sad, isn't it? I don't know, I interpreted the silent as meaning that there's not much going on there. That, you know, England's been around in other parts of the world and done so much, but Africa is silent, which of course, if you know anything about Africa in a literal sense, it is anything but silent. It's quite a noisy part of the world, or at least South Africa. So, is there any more to discuss about that, or shall we move on? Jenny says, Africa is a large area. A small proportion of the population in South Africa is very rich because of oysters and diamonds. But in the majority of Africa, this is not the case. So silent can mean differently when it applies to Africans of different social classes. This would massively predate the modern South African economy. So I found this website, gradesaver.com, which claims that the poem Home Thoughts from Abroad was written in 1845, so that would massively predate the Scramble for Africa by decades. Hmm. I've just had a closer look at this, and it says, talking about the passages, he grows more specific as he imagines April turning to May and how the wise thrush will sing. So I think this is confused. I think they've got mixed. This website's confused about poems, so we can't trust the date it's given. which is a shame. Oh well, although it would be very interesting to know the date the poem was published. Or written, even. Oh, I see the confusion. That was my mistake. The poem we read was called Home Forts from the Sea. This page was about home forts from abroad, so that was my mistake, not theirs. But I still don't know the date, but never mind. That's... If there was a quick way I could look it up, I would. Given that I can't seem to, I don't want to slow us down too much. Jenny says, home fort, so the poet was at Africa when he wrote this poem and he was missing his home England, right? What was his role identity when he was at Africa? That's a good point. That would potentially also explain it if he was travelling at the time. This website, EnglishLanguageAndHistory.com, claims the following. Robert Browning, aboard a ship in sight of Gibraltar, reflects on momentous events in British history that have happened nearby. That's a good point. Maybe from Gibraltar you can see Africa. The north of Africa. That would make sense. And then this takes on a far less sinister tone. Yeah, I reckon that's it. And I reckon I've just concocted this whole questionable interpretation of the poem. I don't think it was anything of the sort. That makes a lot of sense. Oh, and the website also claimed this was made in 1838. This was written in 1838. Although... yeah, that's plausible. That would have made him 26-ish. Depending upon the time of year he was born and the time of year it was written. Okay, that really does change my interpretation of this poem. So once again, nobly, nobly, Cape St. Vincent to the northwest died away. Sunset ran when glorious blood red, reeking into Cadiz Bay. Bluish mid the burning water, full in face of Trafalgar lay. In the dimmest northeast distance dawned Gibraltar grand and grey. Here and here did England help me, how can I help England say? Whoso turns as I this evening, turn to God, pray to praise and pray, while Jove's planet rises yonder, silent over Africa. Jove's planet. I didn't pick up on that before. Jove is another name for Jupiter. So Jove's planet is the planet Jupiter. I missed that. And so it's the planet, it's Jupiter that's being silent. It's not Africa that's being silent. Yeah, but I very much misread this entire poem, didn't I? Or misinterpreted it. Well, once more then. Nobly, nobly, Cape St. Vincent to the northwest died away. Sunset ran one glorious blood red, reeking into Cadiz Bay. Bluish mid the burning water, full in face Trafalgar lay. In the dimmest northeast distance, dawned Gibraltar grand and grey. Here and here did England help me, how can I help England say? Whoso turns as I this evening, turn to God to praise and pray, while Jove's planet rises yonder, silent over Africa. Old-fashioned though it may be, it's quite nice in its way. Right, so is anything more to discuss about this one, or shall we move on? Right, let's move on then. This one is entitled simply Epilogue, which of course is the literary conclusion of a work, the final part. And this is still Robert Browning. At the midnight in the silence of the sleep time, when you set your fancies free, will they pass to where by death falls think imprisoned? Lo, he lies who once so loved you, whom you loved so. Pity me. Oh, to love so, be so loved, yet so mistaken. What had I on earth to do with the slothful, with the mawkish, the unmanly? Like the aimless, helpless, hopeless did I drivel, being who? One who never turned his back but marched breast forward, never doubted clouds would break, never dreamed, though right were worsted, wrong would triumph, held me fall to rise, are baffled to fight better, sleep to wake. None at noonday in the bustle of man's work time greet the unseen with a cheer, bid him forward, breast and back as ever should be, strive and thrive, cry, speed, fight on, fair ever, there as here. I'm a little lost after that one. So let's take it a piece at a time. At the midnight in the silence of the sleep time. Okay. When you set your fancies free. Interesting. I wonder if that's a reference to dreaming, or just generally being in deep thought. Will they pass to where by death falls think imprisoned? By death falls think imprisoned. Well, the grammar of that sentence implies that it's by death imprisoned, and it's something that falls think. Will they pass to where? Ah, okay, but even that is a remark, because it's inside the M dashes. So, will they pass to where lo he lies, who once so loved you, whom you loved so? Pity me. Okay. I think this is speaking to a woman a widow who has lost her husband. So will they pass to where lo he lies, so where his body is, who once so loved you, whom you loved so? So, by death is again it is fairly clear that someone's died. Fools think imprisoned. So I think the point they're making is that because he's dead, he's imprisoned in a place that he can't escape from. But the fools think is contradicting that. It's saying only fools think that being dead means that he's imprisoned. So perhaps his soul or ghost can roam free. Will they pass to where the thing that may pass to where lo he lies are the individual's fancies, which is presumably their thoughts. So it's saying, will your thoughts pass to the husband you have lost, essentially. Jenny says, I don't want to jump to the conclusion too soon, but see, if you assume his poem series is about colonialism, then it seems that what is described here by death imprisoned fits the situation of some of the colonialised areas, at least. I don't think it is to do with colonialism. I think that was my misinterpretation of the previous poem, which I think we now know much better. So, at the midnight in the silence of the sleep time, when you set your fancies free, will they pass to where by fool's death think imprisoned, lo he lies who once so loved you, whom you loved so, pity me. Now the pity me is odd because the speaker refers to the person whom the listener loved in the second person, which implies that it's not him. So it's not clear why the speaker would be saying pity me, unless the poem is being quite free with grammatical person. And so we're to assume that the pity me was being spoken by the deceased and not by the individual who had been speaking to the widow. Could be wrong. Oh, to love so, be so loved, yet so mistaken. What had I on earth to do with the slothful, with the mawkish, the unmanly? Mawkish, let's look that up. As I don't recognise it. Excessively or falsely sentimental, showing a sickly excess of sentiment. Fair enough. Mork plus ish. What's mork then? A slattern. Also from maggot. I wonder how that came to mean showing an excess of sentiment then. Feeling sick or queasy. Sickening or insipid in taste or smell. I wonder if it came to mean... I wonder if the connection between a maggot and the sick feeling could be the sweetness of smell of some decomposing matter, and hence the excessively or falsely sentimental behaviour is causing someone to feel sickly in the same way they would if they smelled that sickly sweet smell. Complete guesswork on my part. Anyway, mawkish. So, oh to be so loved. Oh, sorry. Oh to love so, be so loved, yet so mistaken. What had I on earth to do with the slothful, with the mawkish, the unmanly? Like the aimless, helpless, hopeless, did I drivel? Being who? I'm not fully familiar. I'm not fully following it, but it sounds like this might be an individual regretting their life choices, believing their life to have been aimless, helpless, and hopeless, and they spent their time with the slothful, the mawkish, and the unmanly. So those that are lazy, those which are excessively sentimental, and those that don't possess the proper qualities of being a man. Now, I strongly suspect that unmanly here would have had different connotations back then to what we would imagine now. I suspect exactly the set of things that a man was supposed to be was different, as it does tend to change from place to place and from time to time. So I don't think it's meant to be implying... I don't think it's trying to imply being effeminate in the way that we would think of it today. I suspect it's probably a remark about not having the proper qualities you'd expect from a stable provider, but that's guesswork on my part. So, once again, oh to love so, be so loved, yet so mistaken. What had I on earth to do with the slothful, with the mawkish, the unmanly, like the aimless, helpless, hopeless, did I drivel, being who? So they're not sure. It sounds to me like they're not sure what they'd achieved in their life, who they had been, and what the point of it all was. So I wonder what the connection is between the oh to love so, be so loved, yet so mistaken. I suppose it's just generally a contrast between how wonderful the love was that they shared with this individual and how mistaken they were in their life choices, I assume. I don't think they're suggesting that the love itself was mistaken, or though I could be wrong. So, the next paragraph. One who never turned his back but marched breast forward, never doubted clouds would break, never dreamed, though right were worsted, wrong would triumph. Held we fall to rise, are baffled to fight better, sleep to wake. So, that's gonna need some consideration. One who never turned his back but marched breast forward. So that's describing someone, that's describing an individual, and presumably never turned his back but marched breast forward is implying, or is describing an individual with purpose. Never doubted clouds would break. That's presumably a visual metaphor for having confidence that I think it's suggesting that the individual has confidence that the trials and tribulations that they have to overcome will be overcome easily. I think it's a visual metaphor linking trials and tribulations of one's life with clouds, which are obviously things that are extremely airy and not substantial. And so the idea that they would break in the face of someone marching breast forward. But I could be wrong. Never dreamed, though right were worsted, wrong would triumph. Okay, so such an individual, they never dreamed that wrong would triumph. They always thought that right would triumph. That says though right were worsted. So I think what they're saying is, although wrongs were committed, they never thought for a moment that wrong would triumph. Held we fall to rise, are baffled to fight better, sleep to wake. Okay, baffled here I do not think is being used in the sense of to be confused. I suspect it has a meaning much like hobbled, I'm guessing. Confused and puzzled, having baffles. So what is a baffle? To bewilder completely, to struggle in vain, to foil, to thwart, to publicly disgrace, especially of a recreant knight, to hoodwink or deceive, to scorn, to mock. A device used to dampen the effects of such things as sound, light or fluid. Specifically, a baffle is a surface which is placed inside an open area to inhibit direct motion from one part to another without preventing motion altogether. Tanker trucks use baffles to keep the liquids inside from sloshing around. An architectural feature designed to confuse enemies and make them vulnerable. Right. I think it's using it in the sense of to foil or to thwart. So, one who never, so then there's all these descriptors of this individual. One who never held we fall to rise. No, one who, and never turned his back but much pressed forward is part of the descriptor, so the never isn't part of it. One who, descriptor, held we fall to rise. So from, hold on, so from here to here, these are all descriptors of an individual. Never turned his back but marched pressed forward, never doubted clouds would break, never dreamed though right were worsted, wrong would triumph. And then it continues the sentence. One who held we fall to rise, so we suffer setbacks only so that we can rise ever higher, reach new heights. Held, we are baffled to fight better, so we are thwarted and hindered so that we can in the future fight even better than we already could. And sleep to wake. Now that makes sense. People go to sleep fully expecting to wake up. Sleeping may be in a period of inactivity, but ultimately we're going to wake up. And I suppose this is all... I suppose this links it back to the talk of sleep in the first paragraph, when they're talking about at the midnight in the silence of the sleep time. I don't think it's forming a... I don't think it's trying to form a link in a... What's the word? I don't think that it's linking the two together in a way which conveys meaning. I think it's simply creating related metaphors. So it's keeping the same imagery, but I don't think it's trying to tell us anything by referring back to sleep. So one who never turned his back when march pressed forward, never doubted clouds would break, never dreamed though right were worsted, wrong would triumph, held we fall to rise, are baffled to fight better, sleep to wake. So the individual he's describing sounds like a very capable person, a person with great purpose in their life, a huge optimist. No, at noonday in the bustle of man's work time, greet the unseen with a cheer, bid him forward, breast and back as either should be, strive and thrive, Christ's speed, fight on, fair ever, there as here. No, at the noonday in the bustle of man's work time. That seems clear. Greet the unseen with a cheer. Oh, that could be a reference to those that have passed on. Bid him forward, breast and back, as either should be. So, bid him to make more progress. Strive and thrive, cry. Speed, fight on forever. There as here. There being in the afterlife. This is making sense now. So now I'm wondering how the second paragraph, which ends being who, relates to the description of this very purposeful individual. Because they seem like they're in contradiction. Oh, to love so, to be loved, yet so mistaken. What had I on earth to do with the slothful, with the mawkish, the unmanly, like the aimless, helpless, hopeless did I drivel, being who? That seems to suggest that they were aimless, helpless, and hopeless. One who never turned his back but marched breast forward, never doubted clouds would break, never dreamed though right were worsted, wrong would triumph. Held we fall to rise, are baffled to fight better, sleep to wake. Which seems a contradiction. They seem to be describing different individuals. The best I can think is that the second paragraph finishes with a question. So perhaps the answer to that question is no. Oh, which would explain why the fourth paragraph ends in no. Okay, I think what it may be saying is I wasn't this fantastic individual described in the third paragraph. But please bid those that weren't, such as myself, to strive and thrive in the afterlife. Possibly. I'm not entirely satisfied with that explanation, but it would explain some of it. The only reason I'm in doubt is because this no is followed by a comma. It would make more sense if that no was followed by a full stop, and then this was a new sentence. At noonday in the bustle, men's work time, greet the unseen with a cheer, bid him forward, and so on. That's the best explanation I've got. So, from the top. At the midnight in the silence of the sleep time, when you set your fancies free, will they pass to where by death falls think imprisoned, lo he lies, who once so loved you, whom you loved so, pity me. Oh, to love so, be so loved, yet so mistaken, what I had on earth to do, with the slothful, with the mawkish, the unmanly, like the aimless, helpless, hopeless did I drivel, being who? One who never turned his back but marched breast forward, never doubted clouds would break, never dreamed the right were worsted, wrong would triumph. Held we fall to rise, are baffled to fight better, sleep to wake? No. At noonday in the bustle of man's work time, greet the unseen with a cheer. Bid him forward, breast and back as either should be. Strive and thrive, cry, speed, fight on, forever, there as here. So yes, that's my best explanation. I think it's discussing from a first-person account that those that didn't achieve much in life should still be encouraged to do their best in the afterlife, I think. Thoughts? Or shall we move on? That would also explain why it's called epilogue, because it's essentially the epilogue of a life, as a book might have an epilogue to tie up the loose ends. This is essentially a epilogue of a life, instructing those that have passed on how to tie up their loose ends by fighting on. Okay, we'll move on then. Again, once I understood it, it seemed quite nice. Just took me a while. Assuming I do have the proper understanding. So, Pride and Prejudice. Now, we should probably have a quick recap. In Chapter 1, we were introduced to the Bennet family. There's, of course, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, as well as Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Catherine, who's also known as Kitty, and Lydia. And the family were discussing the fact that a Mr. Bingley, an eligible young gentleman, was moving into the nearby Netherfield Manor. The second chapter, which largely revolved around the fact that in this time there was great formality around social functions, and that before the daughters could even hope to be introduced to Mr. Bingley with a view to perhaps securing a marriage to a nice, fine gentleman, the father would have to begin initiate the connection between the families by visiting Mr. Bingley. And in Chapter 2, we found out that Mr. Bennet had done so after having been asked to do so. He did so at one of the earliest opportunities, but he neglected to tell anyone that that is what he had done, because that appears to be his sense of humour, and he let it go unknown that he had done so for the longest time. But eventually he revealed to his family that he had in fact visited Mr. Bingley, and that therefore the families were acquainted. In Chapter 3, we find that Mr. Bennet is, despite having obviously met Mr. Bingley, he is trying hard not to give a satisfactory description of Mr. Bingley to his wife or daughters, so that they had to find out about him from a neighbour. Mr. Bingley returns the visit, because that's what you do when someone visits you. You return the visit by visiting them at a later date. He returned the visit and visited Mr. Bennet, although he did not meet any other members of the family at the time. I believe they spent their time in Mr. Bennet's study. Subsequent to this, Mr. Bingley sent an invitation to the Bennets to a ball, which they very happily accepted. at the ball, we meet the Hursts. The Hursts are, I believe, Mr. Bingley's eldest sister and her husband, Mr. Hurst. He also has another sister who's younger, obviously. I'm not sure. When I say younger, I mean younger than his older sister. I must admit, I'm not sure if Mr. Bingley was the first child or not. He was certainly the first son, it would appear. We also meet Mr. Darcy, who is a great friend of Mr. Bingley, but has a very different personality. And despite attending the ball, he spent most of the time sitting out, because when I say sitting out, I mean not participating, not necessarily physically sitting, although he may have been, because he didn't feel he knew many people well enough that he wanted to spend time dancing with them, which is a very unsociable thing to do, especially during this period, but that's the way the character was introduced. He managed to, despite most people being very impressed with him at first appearance, both in terms of his assets but also in terms of the way he carried himself in a very noble way, he very quickly made himself unpopular by coming across as excessively proud and having excessively high standards. And then he slighted Elizabeth. Because he was sitting out of the dance, there weren't enough dance partners around, and so Elizabeth ended up being the unlucky female that had to sit out. And then he interpreted that as her having been, he very publicly, saying out loud, interpreted that as some gentleman having turned her down, which not being the case is quite a disrespectful thing to suggest. So he slighted Elizabeth. And at the end of chapter 3 we saw Mr. Bennet trying very hard not to hear too many details of what happened at the ball, because he's very clearly not that interested. Chapter 4 begins with Jane and Elizabeth, the eldest two Bennet daughters, talking about the ball, and it ends with a discussion of the differences between Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley's personalities. Then in chapter 5 we learn more about the Lucases, who are another local family who were also attending the ball, and the fact that Charlotte Lucas is apparently a very good friend of Elizabeth Bennet. Then in chapter 6 we discover that along with a continuing relationship existing between the Bennets and the Darcys, the Bingleys, as in visits were being had, although it sounds like as far as I recall, I believe the Bingleys only had time for Elizabeth and Jane. They weren't that impressed with the rest of the family, despite the point is there had been this continuing relationship between the families, so they were still socialising between each other and appearing at various social gatherings. During this period we find out that Mr. Darcy is in fact falling in love with Elizabeth, despite having previously slighted her. Then in chapter 7 we learn more about the youngest two daughters of the Bennets, Catherine and Lydia. We learn that they've been travelling to see Mrs. Phillips in Meryton a great deal, not least since they found out that there are soldiers stationed in the town recently, and they're all very impressed with the men in uniforms. So they're trying to see that they spend as much time there as possible and learn as much gossip as they can. But importantly, Jane Bennet travels to Netherfield because she's invited there, but she wasn't allowed to use the family carriage, so she ended up travelling on horseback, and the weather was poor and she ended up catching a cold. This was partly her mother's intentions. She thought it would be very good if she fell down with a cold, because then she'd have to spend the night there and potentially a romance would blossom. But we find out that she's actually fallen really quite ill, and Elizabeth then decides to walk there. She also wasn't permitted to take a carriage, so she walks the second part of the way completely on her own, through fields and so on, to the Bingleys, where Jane is currently in bed because she's very ill. And upon arriving, largely the Bingleys are unimpressed with the fact that she, as a lady, has taken it upon herself to go for quite the country ramble to get to their house, and turns up looking rather dishevelled and so on. Felt that general behaviour was unwise, which reflects badly on her, even though it may have come from a very good place, wanting to be there for her sister. And in Chapter 8, this largely continues with Elizabeth being singled out for the reasons I've already mentioned, also for being more interested in reading a book than playing cards with the others. We learn more of Mr. Darcy's high standards, in particular his high standards for young ladies. In particular, he expects them to have to impress him, he expects them to have a great deal of accomplishments, which some of the company there felt were excessive, that individuals such as he described they've never met such individuals. That's certainly what Elizabeth was asserting. And then we find out that Jane is getting worse, and that a Mr. Jones was going to be sent for in the morning, if I recall correctly. Mr. Jones, I don't think he's a doctor, as in, I don't think he has the title of doctor, but it sounds like he fulfills a similar sort of function, but to a lesser, I don't want to say a lesser standard, but he's less qualified, in the same way you wouldn't necessarily say a nurse completes her work to a lesser standard to a doctor. They don't necessarily, it's just they do a much smaller range of things, notionally. That's more or less the impression I had of this Mr. Jones, that he wasn't a doctor, but he fulfilled that role. So rereading the final paragraph, Elizabeth joined them again, only to say that her sister was worse and that she could not leave. Mr. Bingley urged Mr. Jones being sent for immediately, while his sisters, convinced that no country advice could be of any service, recommended an express to town for one of the most eminent physicians. This she would not hear of, but she was not so unwilling to comply with their brother's proposal, and it was settled that Mr. Jones should be sent for early in the morning, if Miss Bennet were not decidedly better. Bingley was quite uncomfortable. His sisters declared that they were miserable. They solaced their wretchedness, however, by duets after supper, while he could find no better relief to his feelings than by giving his housekeeper directions that every possible attention might be paid to the sick lady and her sister. So, that's where we left off. And we are ready to start on Chapter 9. So, Elizabeth passed the chief of the night in her sister's room, and in the morning had the pleasure of being able to send a tolerable answer to the enquiries which she had early received from Mr. Bingley by a housemaid, and some time afterwards from the two elegant ladies who waited on his sisters. In spite of this amendment, however, she requested to have a note sent to Longbourn, I believe that's the settlement where her family reside, or it could be the name of their house, actually, desiring her mother to visit Jane and form her own judgment of her situation. The note was immediately dispatched, and its contents as quickly complied with. Mrs. Bennet, accompanied by her two youngest girls, reached Netherfield soon after the family breakfast. Had she found Jane in any apparent danger, Mrs. Bennet would have been very miserable, but being satisfied on seeing her that her illness was not alarming, she had no wish of her recovering immediately, as her restoration to health would probably remove her from Netherfield. She would not listen, therefore, to her daughter's proposal of being carried home. Neither did the apothecary, who arrived about the same time, think it at all advisable, after sitting a little while with Jane on Miss Bingley's appearance and invitation, the mother and 3 daughters all attended her into the breakfast parlour. Bingley met them with hopes that Mrs. Bennet had not found Miss Bennet worse than she expected. "Indeed I have, sir," was her answer. "She is a great deal too ill to be moved. Mr. Jones says we must not think of moving her. We must trespass a little longer on your kindness." So Mr. Jones then must be the apothecary, whereas they were previously talking about contacting a physician. So that clears that matter up. "Indeed I have, sir," was her answer. "She is a—" "Oh, sorry, I've just read that." "Removed!" cried Bingley. "It must not be thought of. My sister, I am sure, will not hear of her removal." "You may depend upon it, madam," said Miss Bingley with cold civility, "that Miss Bennet shall receive every possible attention while she remains with us." Mrs. Bennet was profuse in her acknowledgments. "I am sure," she added, "if it was not for such good friends, I do not know what would become of her, for she is very ill indeed, and suffers a vast deal, though with the greatest patience in the world, which is always the way with her, for she has, without exception, the sweetest temper I have ever met with. I often tell my other girls they are nothing to her. You have a sweet room here, Mr. Bingley, and a charming prospect over that gravel I walk. I do not know a place in the country that is equal to Netherfield. You will not think of quitting it in a hurry, I hope, though you have but a short lease." What do they mean by prospect in that sense? A charming prospect. The region which the eye overlooks at one time. View, scene, outlook. That's very clear. "Whatever I do is done in a hurry," replied he, "and therefore if I should resolve to quit Netherfield I should probably be off in 5 minutes. At present, however, I consider myself as quite fixed here." "That is exactly what I should have supposed of you," said Elizabeth. "You begin to comprehend me, do you?" cried he, turning towards her. "Oh yes, I understand you perfectly. I wish I might take this for a compliment, but to be so easily seen through, I'm afraid, is pitiful. That is as it happens. It does not necessarily follow that a deep, intricate character is more or less estimable than such a one as yours." "Lizzie," cried her mother, "remember where you are, and do not run on in the wild manner that you are suffered to do at home." "I did not know before," continued Bingley immediately, "that you are a studier of character. It must be an amusing study." "Yes, but intricate characters are the most amusing. They have at least that advantage." "The country," said Darcy, "can in general supply but a few subjects for such a study. In a country neighbourhood you move in a very confined and unvarying society. But people themselves alter so much, and that there is something new to be observed in them forever." "Yes, indeed," cried Mrs. Bennet, offended by his manner of mentioning a country neighbourhood. I assure you there is quite a lot of that going on in the country as in town." Everybody was surprised, and Darcy, after looking at her for a moment, turned silently away. Mrs. Bennet, who fancied she had gained a complete victory over him, continued her triumph. "I cannot see that London is at any great advantage over the country. For my part, except the shops and the public places, the country is a vast deal pleasanter, is it not, Mr. Bingley?" "When I am in the country," he replied, "I never wish to leave it, and when I am in town it is pretty much the same. They have each their advantages, and I can be equally happy in either." "Aye, that is because you have the right disposition. But that gentleman," looking at Darcy, "seemed to think the country was nothing at all." "Indeed, mamma, you are mistaken," said Elizabeth, blushing for her mother. "You quite mistook Mr. Darcy. He only meant that there was not such a variety of people to be met with in the country as in town, which you must acknowledge to be true." "Certainly, my dear, nobody said there were. But as to not meeting with many people in this neighbourhood, I believe there are a few neighbourhoods larger. I know we dine with 24 families." Nothing but concern for Elizabeth could enable Bingley to keep his countenance. His sister was less delicate, and directed her eyes towards Mr. Darcy with a very expressive smile, Elizabeth, for the sake of saying something that might turn her mother's thoughts, now asked if Charlotte Lucas had been at Longbourn since her coming away. Yes, she called yesterday with her father, with an agreeable man Sir William is. What an agreeable man Sir William is. That's Sir William Lucas, her father. Mr. Bingley, is not he? So much the man of fashion, so genteel and so easy. There's always something to say to everybody. That is my idea of good breeding. And those persons who fancy themselves very important and never open their mouths quite mistake the matter. Did Charlotte dine with you? No, she would go home. I fancy she wanted about the mince pies. For my part, Mr. Bingley, I always keep servants that can do their own work. My daughters are brought up differently, but everybody is to judge for themselves, and the Lucases are a very good sort of girls, I assure you. It is a pity they are not handsome. Not that I think Charlotte is so very plain, but then she's our particular friend. I'm not I don't entirely follow the I always keep servants that can do their own work, because I'm not sure what the alternative would be. But still. She seems a very pleasant young woman, said Bingley. Oh dear, yes, but you must own she is very plain. Lady Lucas herself has often said so, and envied me Jane's beauty. I do not like to boast of my own child, but to be sure, Jane. One does not often see anybody better looking. It is what everybody says. I do not trust my own partiality. When she was only 15, there was a gentleman at my brother Gardiner's in town so much in love with her that my sister-in-law was sure he would make her an offer before we came away, but, however, he did not. Perhaps he thought her too young. However, he wrote some verses on her, and very pretty they were. And so ended his affection, said Elizabeth impatiently. There have been many a one, I fancy, overcome in the same way. I wonder who first discovered the efficacy of poetry in driving away love. I have been used to consider poetry as the food. I have been used to consider poetry as the food of love, said Darcy. Of a fine, stout, healthy love it may. Everything nourishes what is strong already. But if it be only a slight thin sort of inclination, I am convinced that one good sonnet will starve it entirely away. Darcy only smiled, and the general pause which ensued made as if Elizabeth trembled lest her mother should be exposing herself again. She longed to speak, but could think of nothing to say, and after a short silence Mrs. Bennet began repeating her thanks to Mr. Bingley for his kindness to Jane, with an apology for troubling him also with Lizzie. Mr. Bingley was unaffectedly civil in his answer, and forced his younger sister to be civil also. Okay, so presumably his sister is younger than him then. And say what, although he has two, and say what the occasion required. She performed her part indeed without much graciousness, but Mrs. Bennet was satisfied, and soon afterwards ordered her carriage. Upon this signal, the youngest of her daughters put herself forward. The two girls had been whispering to each other during the whole visit, and the result of it was that the youngest should tax Mr. Bingley with having promised on his first coming into the country to give a ball at Netherfield. I don't completely follow that, because they've already had a ball. Or perhaps, was the previous ball at Netherfield, or was it simply that Mr. Bingley was in attendance? I'm fairly certain he was host. The two girls had been whispering to each other during the whole visit, and the result of it was that the youngest should tax Mr. Bingley with having promised on his first coming into the country to give a ball at Netherfield. Lydia was a stout, well-grown girl of 15, with a fine complexion and good-humoured countenance, a favourite with her mother, whose affection had brought her into public at an early age. She had a high animal spirit and a sort of natural self-consequence, which the attentions of the officers to whom her uncle's good dinners and her own easy manners recommended her, had increased into assurance. She was very equal, therefore, to address Mr. Bingley on the subject of the ball, and abruptly reminded him of his promise, adding that it would be the most shameful thing in the world if he did not keep it. His answer to the sudden attack was delightful to their mother's ear. "I'm perfectly ready, I assure you, to keep my engagement. When your sister is recovered, you shall, if you please, name the very day of the ball. But you would not wish to be dancing while she is ill." Lydia declared herself satisfied. "Oh yes, it would be much better to wait till Jane was well, and by that time most likely Captain Carter will be at Meryton again. And when you have given your ball," she added, "I shall insist on their giving one also. I shall tell Colonel Foster it will be quite a shame if he does not." Okay, so I'm guessing then the previous ball was only a ball in which he was in attendance then. But he had made the promise to host a ball. That would be my guess. Mrs. Bennet and her daughters then departed, and Elizabeth returned instantly to Jane, leaving her own and her relations' behaviour to the remarks of the two ladies and Mr. Darcy, the latter of whom, however, could not be prevailed on to join in their censure of her, in spite of all Miss Bingley's witticisms on fine eyes. Interesting. I feel like that's a reference going over my head. Chapter 10. The day passed much as the day before had done. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley had spent some hours of the morning with the invalid, who continued, though slowly, to mend, and in the evening Elizabeth joined their party in the drawing-room. The loo table, however, did not appear. Mr. Darcy was writing, and Miss Bingley, seated near him, was watching the progress of his letter, and repeatedly calling off his attention by messages to his sister. Mr. Hurst and Miss Bingley were at piquet, that's a card game, and Mrs. Hurst was observing their game. Elizabeth took up some needlework and was sufficiently amused in attending to what passed between Darcy and his companion. The perpetual commendations of the lady, either on his handwriting or on the evenness of his lines, or on the length of his letter, with the perfect unconcern with which her praises were received, formed a curious dialogue, and was exactly in unison with her opinion of each other. With her opinion of each. "How delighted Miss Darcy will be to receive such a letter." He made no answer. "You write uncommonly fast." "You're mistaken, I write rather slowly." "How many letters you must have occasion to write in the course of a year? Letters of business too? How odious I should think them. It is fortunate then that they fall to my lot instead of to yours. Pray tell your sister that I long to see her. I've already told her so once by your desire. I'm afraid you do not like your pen. Let me mend it for you. I mend pens remarkably well." "Thank you, but I always mend my own." "How can you contrive to write so even?" He was silent. "Tell your sister I am delighted to hear of her improvement on the harp, and pray tell her know that I am quite in raptures with her beautiful little design for a table, and I think it infinitely superior to Miss Grantley's. Will you give me leave to defer your raptures till I write again? At present I have not room to do them justice." "Oh, it is of no consequence. I shall see her in January. But do you always write such charmingly long letters to her, Mr. Darcy?" "They are generally long, but whether always charming it is not for me to determine. It is a rule with me that a person who can write a long letter with ease cannot write ill." "That will not do for a compliment to Darcy, Caroline," cried her brother, "because he does not write with ease. He studies too much for words of 4 syllables. Do you not, Darcy?" "My style of writing is very different from yours." "Oh," cried Miss Bingley, "Charles writes in the most careless way imaginable. He leaves out half his words and blots the rest." So Mr. Bingley is presumably Charles Bingley. "My ideas flow so rapidly that I have not time to express them, by which means my letters sometimes convey no ideas at all to my correspondents." "Your humility, Mr. Bingley," said Elizabeth, "must disarm reproof." I didn't follow that. "Must disarm reproof." An act or instance of reproving or of reprobating, a rebuke, a reproach, an admonition. So, your humility, Mr. Bingley, must disarm rebuke, is essentially what it's saying. Ah, I see. So she's saying, you've been so humble that I cannot rebuke you. Nothing is more deceitful, said Darcy, than the appearance of humility. It is often only carelessness of opinion, and sometimes an indirect boast. And which of the two do you call my little recent piece of modesty? The indirect boast, for you are really proud of your defects in writing, because you consider them as proceeding from a rapidity of thought and carelessness of execution, which, if not estimable, you think at least highly interesting. The power of doing anything with quickness is always much prized by the possessor, and often without any attention to the imperfection of the performance. When you told Mrs. Bennet this morning that if you ever resolved on quitting Netherfield you should be gone in 5 minutes, you meant it to be a sort of panegyric. That's one to look up. Of compliment to yourself. Panegyric. A formal speech publicly praising someone or something. When you told Mrs. Bennet this morning that if you ever resolved on quitting Netherfield you should be gone in 5 minutes, you meant it to be a sort of panegyric of compliment to yourself, and yet, what is there so very laudable in a precipitance which must leave very necessary business undone, and can be of no real advantage to yourself or any one else? Panegyric. Okay. Panegyric. Nay, cried Bingley, this is too much to remember at night all the foolish things that were said in the morning, and yet upon my honour I believe what I said to myself to be true, and I believe it at this moment at least. Therefore I did not assume the character of a needless precipitance merely to show off before the ladies. I dare say you believed it, but I am by no means convinced that you would be gone with such celerity. Celerity? Speed or swiftness? From Latin celeritas. Your conduct would be quite as dependent on chance as that of any man I know, and if as you were mounting your horse a friend were to say, Bingley, you had better stay till next week, you would probably do it, you would probably not go, and another word might stay a month. You have only proved by this, cried Elizabeth, that Mr. Bingley did not do justice to his own disposition. You have shown him off now much more than he did himself. I am exceedingly gratified, said Bingley, by your converting what my friend says into a compliment on the sweetness of my temper, but I'm afraid you are giving it a turn which that gentleman did by no means intend, for he would certainly think the better of me, if under such circumstances I were to give a flat denial and ride off as fast as I could. Would Mr. Darcy then consider the rashness of your original intention as atoned for by your obstinacy in adhering to it? Upon my word, I cannot exactly explain the matter. Darcy must speak for himself. Expect me to account for opinions which you chose to call mine, but which I have never acknowledged. Allowing the case, however, to stand according to your representation, you must remember, Miss Bennet, that the friend who is supposed to desire his return to the house, and the delay of his plans, has merely desired it, asked it without offering one argument in favour of its propriety. To yield readily, easily to the persuasion of a friend is no merit with you. To yield without conviction is no compliment to the understanding of either. I didn't follow the second one. To yield readily, easily to the persuasion of a friend is no merit with you. Interesting they chose with. But otherwise that makes perfect sense. Interesting that the authoress chose with. Otherwise that makes perfect sense. To yield without conviction is no compliment to the understanding of either. Okay, I would suggest in this context they probably mean the state of being wholly convinced. I was, of course, familiar with the meaning of a firmly held belief or a judgment of guilt, but I suppose they mean the state of being wholly convinced. So, to yield without being wholly convinced is no compliment to the understanding of either. Either what? I suppose either you or the friend that is trying to convince you. So it doesn't complement your understanding of the situation or that of the person that's trying to convince you, if they haven't even made an attempt to convince you. I think that's what they're saying. You appear to me, Mr. Darcy, to allow nothing for the influence of friendship and affection. A regard for the requester would often make one readily yield to a request without waiting for arguments to reason one into it. I'm not particularly speaking of such a case as you supposed about Mr. Bingley. You may as well wait, perhaps, till the circumstances occurs before we discuss the discretion of his behaviour thereupon. But in general, in ordinary cases between friend and friend, where one of them is desired by the other to change a resolution of no very great moment, should you think ill of that person for not complying with the desire without waiting to be argued into it? Would it not be advisable, before we proceed on this subject, to arrange with rather more precision of the degree of importance which is to appertain to this request, as well as the degree of intimacy subsisting between the parties? By all means, cried Bingley. Let us hear all the particulars, not forgetting their comparative heights and size, for that will have more weight in the argument. Miss Bennet, then you may be aware, for that will have more weight in the argument, Miss Bennet, than you may be aware of. I assure you that if Darcy were not such a great tall fellow, in comparison with myself, I should not pay him half so much deference. I declare I do not know a more awful object than Darcy on particular occasions and in particular places, at his own house especially, and of Sunday evening when he has nothing to do. Mr. Darcy smiled, but Elizabeth thought she could perceive that he was rather offended, and therefore checked her laugh. Miss Bingley warmly resented the indignity he had received in an expostulation. So that would... An expostulation is the occurrence of something coming out, presumably? The act of reasoning earnestly in order to dissuade or remonstrate. From expostulatio, complaint, expostulation. From expostulo, demand, expulate. From ex, out of, postulo, demand or claim. Oh, okay. So the act of reasoning earnestly in order to dissuade or remonstrate. Miss Bingley warmly resented the indignity he had received in an expostulation with her brother for talking such nonsense. I see your design, Bingley, said his friend. You disliked an argument and want to silence us. Perhaps I do. Arguments are too much like disputes. If you and Miss Bennet will defer yours till I am out of the room, I shall be very thankful, and then you may say whatever you like of me. What you ask, said Elizabeth, is to sacrifice on my side, and Mr. Darcy had much better finish this letter. Sorry, what you ask, said Elizabeth, is no sacrifice on my side, and Mr. Darcy had much better finish this letter. Mr. Darcy took her advice and did finish his letter. When that business was over, he applied to Miss Bingley and Elizabeth for the indulgence of some music. Miss Bingley moved with alacrity. I feel like I've looked that one up before. Alacrity. Eagerness, liveliness, or enthusiasm. Coined between 1500 and 1510 from Latin alacritus, from alacer, brisk, itas iti. Miss Bingley moved with alacrity to the pianoforte, and after a polite request that Elizabeth would lead the way, with the other as politely and more earnestly negatived, she seated herself. I understand. Miss Bingley moved with alacrity to the pianoforte, so she moved to it quickly and with eagerness, and after a polite request that Elizabeth would lead the way, which the other as politely and more earnestly negatived. So, would you play first? No, thank you. She seated herself, so Miss Bingley seated herself. Mrs. Hurst sang with her sister, and while they were thus employed, Elizabeth could not help observing, as she turned over some music books that lay on the instrument, how frequently Mr. Darcy's eyes were fixed on her. She hardly knew how to suppose that she could be an object of admiration to so great a man, and yet that he should look at her because he disliked her was still more strange. She could only imagine, however, at last, that she drew his notice because there was something about her more wrong and reprehensible, according to his idea of right, than in any other person present. The supposition did not pain her. She liked him too little to care for his approbation. After playing some Italian songs, Miss Bingley varied the charm by a lively Scotch air, and soon afterwards, Mr. Darcy, drawing near Elizabeth, said to her, "Do you not feel a great inclination, Miss Bennet, to see such an opportunity of dancing a reel?" "Oh, do you not feel a great inclination, Miss Bennet, to see such an opportunity of dancing a reel?" She smiled, but made no answer. He repeated the question with some surprise at her silence. "Oh," said she, "I heard you before, but I could not immediately determine what to say in reply. You wanted me, I know, to say yes, that you might have the pleasure of despising my taste, but I always delight in overthrowing those kind of schemes and cheating a person of their premeditated contempt. I have therefore made up my mind to tell you that I do not want to dance a reel at all, and now despise me if you dare." "Indeed I do not dare." Elizabeth, having rather expected to affront him, was amazed at his gallantry, but there was a mixture of sweetness and archness in her manner which made it difficult for her to affront anybody. And Darcy had never been so bewitched by any woman as he was by her. He really believed that were it not for the inferiority of her connections, he should be in some danger. Miss Bingley saw, or suspected enough to be jealous, and her great anxiety for the recovery of her dear friend Jane received some assistance from her desire of getting rid of Elizabeth. She often tried to provoke Darcy into disliking her guest by talking of their supposed marriage and planning his happiness in such an alliance. "I hope," said she, as they were walking together in the shrubbery the next day, "you will give your mother-in-law a few hints, when this desirable event takes place, as to the advantage of holding her tongue, and if you can compass it, do cure the younger girls of running after the officers. And if I mention so delicate a subject, endeavour to check that little something bordering on conceit and impertinence which your lady possesses." Not very nice. That's interesting, because does that mean... I thought the oldest Bingley daughter was the one that was married, but Miss Bingley would be the oldest, and she's Mrs. Hurst. So that even means that I had it wrong, and it's a younger sister that's married, or perhaps when one of the sisters marries, the next oldest becomes just Miss so-and-so as opposed to Miss first name surname. Anyway. Have you anything else to propose for my domestic felicity? Oh yes, do let the portraits of your uncle and Aunt Phillips be placed in the gallery at Pemberley. Put them next to your great uncle the judge. They're in the same profession, you know, only in different lines. As for your Elizabeth's picture, you must not attempt to have it taken, for what painter could do justice to those beautiful eyes? So perhaps that's what the reference to fine eyes before is about. Perhaps because the eyes is a common love object, she's been teasing him about her having beautiful eyes constantly. And this was a joke about his uncle and aunt judging people heavily, I believe. It would not be easy indeed to catch their expression, but their colour and shape and the eyelashes so remarkably fine might be copied. At that moment they were met from another walk by Mrs. Hurst and Elizabeth herself. "I did not know that you intended to walk," said Miss Bingley in some confusion, lest they had been overheard. You used us abominably ill," answered Mrs. Hurst, "running away without telling us that you were coming out." Then taking the disengaged arm of Mr. Darcy, she left Elizabeth to walk by herself. The path just admitted 3. Mr. Darcy felt their rudeness and immediately said, "This walk is not wide enough for a party. We had better go into the avenue." But Elizabeth, who had not the least inclination to remain with them, laughingly answered, No, stay where you are. You are charmingly grouped and appear to uncommon advantage. The picturesque would be spoilt by admitting a 4th. Goodbye." The picturesque was a particular ideal of the perfect, beautiful landscape, I believe, around this period. So I wonder if an element of the picturesque was things coming in 3s, and therefore the picturesque would be spoilt by admitting a 4th could be a joke relying on such an observation. That's guesswork on my part. She then ran gaily off, rejoicing as she rambled about in the hope of being at home again in a day or 2. Jane was already so much recovered as to intend leaving her room for a couple of hours that evening. So, I think that will do for Pride and Prejudice today. Is there anything anybody in chat would like to discuss about it, or shall we move on? I suppose we'll move on then. So I assume this is where we left off last time. This is probably the last one we did, number 17. When our story would begin, we first must trace our origin, a weary task then sure as mine, who trace it from both sides the line, and true it is, I owe my birth to animals as well as earth. My being to such climates owe, as vertical heat and endless snow. I've been a tree, I've been a ram, insects have been what I am. Though straight, well-formed, and never sick, I cannot stand without a stick. Pleasing and useful to one sense, I to another give offence. I'm born for a domestic use, yet often witness great abuse. I villains serve to aid their flight, the good to bring their deeds to light. In others lunacy is dreaded, but I please most when most light-headed. And that was a candle. So, the first enigma of tonight. Before a circle let appear, twice 25 and 5 in a year, 1/5 of 8 subjoin, and then you'll quickly find what conquers men. Twice 25 and 5 in rear. Twice 25 is 50. That's what they mean by 5 in rear. So 5 followed by 50 perhaps? 1/5 of 8 subjoin. And then you'll quickly find what conquers men. I wonder if subjoin has a very specific meaning that I'm unfamiliar with. To add something to the end, to append or annex. Interesting. I suppose because sub would be under, so to join under. Ah, and synonyms under join, that makes sense. Jenny says love. Could you explain that? Jenny says yes, conquer men. Or possibly, but I feel there's a lot more there which it doesn't fully fit, or at least if it does fit, it's not immediately obvious what the connection is. Jenny said, hey, the shape of the heart looks like number 25. How so? I'm not sure I see it. Twice 25 and 5 in rear. 1/5 of 8 subjoin and then we'll quickly find what conquers men. Although it's an interesting idea that this could be pictographic, before a circle let appear, twice 25 and 5 in rear, 1/5 of 8 subjoin and then you quickly find what conquers men. Yeah, this one I'm really not getting, so I may just look it up. Oh dear, I think I may have revealed a few more than I meant to. It is love. I really don't understand that one. I just don't. For a circle let appear, twice 25 and 5 in rear, 1/5 of 8 subjoin and then you'll quickly find what conquers men. I don't get it. I just don't. Oh well. Moving on. 19. Begotten and born and dying with noise, the terror of women and pleasure of boys, like the fictions of poets concerning the wind, I'm chiefly unruly when strongest confined. For silver and gold I don't trouble my head, but all I delight in is pieces of lead. Except when I trade with a ship or a town, why then I make pieces of iron go down. One property more I would have you remark, no lady was ever more fond of a spark. Whenever I get one, my soul's all on fire, I roar out my joy and in transports expire. I mean, that really does sound like a cannon. Just double checking begotten. Brought into being by one's begetter. So, begotten, born, and dying with noise. So noisily made, noisily destroyed. That makes sense of a canon. The terror of women and pleasure of boys. Again, like the fictions of poets concerning the wind, I'm chiefly unruly when strongly confined. I mean, that sort of describes the way the explosion forces a cannonball out of a cannon. For silver and gold I trouble not my head, but all I delight in is pieces of lead. Except when I trade with a ship or town, why then I make pieces of iron go down. One property more I'd have you remark, no lady was ever more fond of a spark. Whenever I get one, my soul's all on fire, I roar out my joy, and in transports expire. Okay, roaring out my joy, that narrows it down. It's certainly not a cannonball we're talking about. Although I am intrigued by the make pieces of iron go down, because this is long before the period of ironclads. Well, anyway, I'm fairly certain the answer must be canon, and it appears Jenny agrees with me. Oh, I did it again. Canon. So, 20. I'm most conspicuous, though I'm formed to hide. I'm still of use, even when I'm laid aside. I aid the viewer, yet obstruct the sight, and love the day, though set against the light. From Italy I make my name and birth, and now my offerings spread over all the earth. Though different forms I take, I mostly sing, true to one colour, nature's favourite green. Could it be some type of flower? Or, well, probably a plant more than a flower. I'm most conspicuous, though I'm formed to hide. I'm still of use, even when I'm laid aside. I aid the viewer, yet obstruct the sight, and love the day, though set against the light. From Italy I make my name and birth, and now my offerings spread over all the earth. Though different forms I take, I mostly sing, true to one colour, nature's favourite green. Could be a type of tree. But I'm not sure why they would say it's formed to hide, if that were the case. I'm thinking about what the I aid the viewer yet obstruct the sight could be. Because a tree may look very may very much improve a view, but it's strictly speaking obstructing sight. Jenny says smoke. I'm not seeing it. I don't see. In particular, the from Italy I take my name and birth. I feel like it may be a species of tree which is named after a region in Italy or something like that. That's the best I can think of. I don't think I'm gonna get it. Venetian blind. That makes sense. True to one colour, nature's favourite green. So apparently Venetian blinds were green. Wonder how old they are. Interesting. 21. 3/4 of a cross and a circle complete. 2 semicircles and a perpendicular meet. A triangle standing on 2 feet. 2 semicircles and a circle complete. Yeah, number 20 was Venetian blinds. Number 21, 3/4 of a cross and a circle complete. 2 semicircles and a perpendicular meet. A triangle standing on 2 feet. 2 semicircles and a circle complete. I don't know. Any guesses, chat? It's a shame to have to give up on 2 in a row, but again, this This feels like one that I just won't know the answer to. Tobacco. Oh, Jenny did guess tobacco, but... Ah, it's spelling out the... It's the letters. T being the 3/4 of a cross, the O being a circle, the two semicircles and a perpendicular meet, B, the triangle on two legs is the A, the two more semicircles and the final circle being the last bit. Okay, I apologise, Jenny, I was confused, but you were in fact correct. Interesting. I really couldn't see it, but now that makes sense. Alright, let's try one more. I don't seem to be doing too well at them today, but let's try one more. What honours, what rebuffs we share, whose duty 'tis to serve the fair, gay though I'm dressed, as new made lord, I'm grave enough for council board. Whether I wait in silk or woolen, my lady'll now be kind, now sullen, high now in favour, straight begone, commended now, now trampled on, now seated by her own bedside, doomed now the wooden horse to ride, now shook perhaps or soundly beat, permitted next to kiss her feet. But though I've often borne disgrace, what foes have envied me my place, he that my mistress favour gain, let him my name and post explain. What honours, what rebuffs we share, whose duty 'tis to serve the fair. Gay though I'm dressed as new made lord, I'm grave enough for council board. Whether I wait in silk or woolen, my lady now be kind, now sullen, high now in favour, straight begone, commended now, now trampled on, now seated by her own bedside, doomed now the wooden horse to ride. Now shook perhaps or soundly beat, permitted next to kiss her feet. But though I've often borne disgrace, what foes have envied me my place, he that my mistress favour gain, let him my name and post explain. Jenny guesses a shadow. We had shadow fairly recently, although I suppose it isn't impossible it could be there twice. What honours, what robust we show, whose duty 'tis to serve the fair. I don't think if it were a shadow, they wouldn't be stressing the fact that they're serving women. Gay though I'm dressed as new-made lord, I'm grave enough for council board, whether I wait in silk or woolen, my lady now be kind, now sullen, high now in favours, straight begone, commended now trampled on, now seated by her own bedside, doomed now the wooden horse to ride, now shook perhaps or soundly beat, permitted next to kiss her feet. But though I've often borne disgrace, what foes have envied me my place, he that my mistress favour gain, let him my name and post explain. I mean, some of it might figure with it being a stocking, although historically stockings weren't strictly speaking a women's only garment. I don't know if in this period they would have been. But it doesn't figure with all of it. But the soundly beat sounds more like it could be about beating dust and dirt out of an outer garment. Permitted next to kiss her feet is a very interesting one though. Could it be a dress and some of this could be a reference to how fashions change? So what honours, what robust we share. Well, dresses certainly can be admired or looked down upon, whose duty 'tis to serve the fair. It would be women wearing dresses. Gay though I'm dressed as a new male lord, I'm grave enough for council board. Kinda makes sense, in the sense that a dress could be pretty, but it's also formal attire, maybe. Whether I wait in silk or woolen, my lady now be kind, now sullen. High now in favours, straight begone. So this could be a reference to changing fashions. Commended now trampled on. We wouldn't usually trample on a dress, so maybe that doesn't figure. Now seated by her own bedside, doomed now the wooden horse to ride. I'm not entirely certain what that's a reference to. It sounds almost like putting up on a stand or something like that. Now shook perhaps or soundly beat and permitted next to kiss her feet. I was thinking that could be dresses getting longer, and kissing being used in the sense of just meeting. But though I've often borne disgrace, what both have envied me my place, he that my mistress favour game, let him my name and post explain. Jenny says life. Well, we wouldn't usually describe our life as being silk or woolen. I do think whatever it is probably a garment, hence the reference to silk or woolen, and it's probably something that's highly subject to fashion, hence the reference to high now in favour. Because there are some garments which are strictly of a practical nature, and so they don't change as much. And the fact that they refer to them... The fact that they refer to them as being specific to women also narrows it down. Yeah, and the soundly beat suggests to me that it's probably an outer garment. Plus, of course, it would have been considered decent to talk about back in those times. And the kiss her feet bit, again, that... So, again, assuming I'm right in my assumptions, that really narrows it down. I'm going to guess a dress then. And that's the best theory I have. Nope, that wasn't the... Oh dear. Oh, I think I remember. Yes. Sorry about that. Being foolish. Stockings. I guessed stockings earlier, didn't I? I mean, it fits with quite a lot of the lines, but I'm surprised they considered them to be a garment strictly for women at this point, but apparently they did. So, a bit embarrassing. I didn't guess that in the end, but there we are. That was the solution. Jen says, but it's not a lady who wears stockings. Look at, say, Henry VIII. Yes, I know. Historically, stockings were worn by both sexes. But obviously this is later than that. This is well past Tudor times. This book came out in... When did this book come out? It was either the late 1700s or the very early 1800s, I think. Yeah, 1806. I guess that makes sense, actually, now I think about it. By 1806, I think fashion certainly had reached a point where men wouldn't have been wearing stockings, so yeah. Perhaps I should have stuck to my guns. Anyway. Thank you to everyone that has taken the time to watch my content. I will be streaming next on Friday, in which I will be doing some more RimWorld. After that, it will be Monday, when I'll be continuing Monkey Island 2, LeChuck's Revenge. And finally, Wednesday, we'll be back to this poetry, literature, and riddles stream. So, once again, thank you, and good night.